Are you traveling with your bike? And are you doing it right? Or would you rather drive 20 hours, take an overnight ferry, drive another 10 hours rather than contemplate packing and unpacking your bike? Well, we're here today with a special guest who's going to help us take the fear out of traveling with your bike. It is quite possible, likely even, that you'll travel to your next triathlon. Triathlons tend to happen in idyllic places where the water is warm and the sun is shining, normally. Anyway, and that means travel, and that means travel with your bike. Now, your first thought is probably, I don't know anything about building my bike, so I'll just take it to the local bike shop when I get there and they can do it for me. Fair enough. But local bike shops, especially around races, are very busy. And they probably don't have time to fix your bike because they're fixing bikes that have been broken in transit or are some other way not fit to race on. And if they do have time to do it, they will, quite rightly, charge you a premium for the service. So you need to be somewhat self-sufficient when you get to your race. And that means learning to build your bike properly. All right, time to introduce my special guest. Meet Owen. Owen is a bike mechanic, and a pretty handy one. He's worked on some pretty famous people's bikes over years. Thanks for joining us, Owen.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Owen's going to show us how to unpack your bike and what you should look for in case things don't go particularly well. So let's unpack my bike, and fingers crossed the EasyJet was actually kind to it, because I literally did travel with this bike and I literally haven't opened it yet. So I should probably take the wheel out first. Let's take the wheel out so we don't stand on the wheel. Don't want to stand on your wheel.
Yeah, that's actually a good top tip. Don't stand on your wheels.
Yeah.
So I guess one thing just to add is, okay, we're in a set. We're not in a hotel room. Budget wouldn't stretch, unfortunately. But just be mindful about, getting your bike out. You'll need a lot of space, but there's lots of little bits. So you're taking your seat post out, and often the seat post clamp, if it's integrated in the frame, sometimes they're not captive. So that means they can either fall somewhere in the bag or into the frame. So just be careful and mindful about when you're getting stuff out, not to just launch it out, but have some sort of like care and attention to place it out in a logical way. So if something is missing, you can see that it's missing.
All right, let's pause there before I pull the bike out unceremoniously and talk about the tools that you travel with. So I have this tool bag, and it's grown over the years. Don't probably need everything in here, but it is a good idea to have a dedicated tool bag. And this is actually where my seat post clamp is. Kept it safe and sound. Don't have a towel to put it on, so I'm going to put it right there. Don't kick it under the bed. Most important thing in my tool bag, I think, is probably this. If you don't know what this is, Owen's going to tell you now. It's a very important tool.
It's a super important tool. So it is a torque wrench. So when you're applying, like when you're tightening a bolt, lots of parts on your bike, whether it be the seat post clamp or your bars, your stem, or even in some cases your wheel, will be done up to a certain torque rating. So it's often in Newton meters, or it could be pounds per feet, depending on where you are. They'll have different settings. Effectively, it's a spring force that you're overcoming, and it will click when it reaches that torque rating. But for a lot of super light carbon parts, and actually super light alloy parts, it's an essential tool, because if you over tighten something, well, it can snap and break, and that's not what you want come race day.
Yeah. Important tool, a torque wrench.
Yeah.
All right.
Not cracking success.
Yeah, okay. Pedals, pump. There we go, sorted. Okay.
Pump. I mean, I've worked luckily at lots of triathlons, which is very fun. Don't forget to take a pump.
Yeah. So I've got a nice little travel pump here. This has served me well for many, many years. Pack's nice and small, got a good sensor on there so you know how much air you've put in your tires. And this is important, because wheeling your bike by hand all the way down to the mechanic wherever he is at the next hotel or at the expo because you don't have a pump is not fun, and also not very productive, and also bike mechanics just don't want to see people to use their pump. They're, as we said already, they're busy. So take a little pump. It is a worthwhile investment. If you're going to be traveling to race, just a small travel pump is very much worth it. Okay. So my bike, as you can see, Canyon Speed Max, and it's in a Canyon bag. Luxury, I know. I've got a bag that's specifically designed for the bike that I'm traveling with. I understand that most of you won't have this. I'm very lucky. I'm spoilt here at GTN. But either way, you're going to have pretty standard things that you need to do when you travel with your bike. One of them is rear derailleur off. You're always going to take the rear derailleur off when you travel. Even if your bike bag says No, not necessary to take your rear derailleur off when you travel. Take your rear derailleur off.
Yeah, always take it off, purely because it's attached to a really tiny little tab, mech hanger, so rear mech hanger, which is alloy, and it's literally designed to fail. The idea of a mech hanger is that it fails rather than writing your whole frame off if the rear mech has an impact with, I don't know, a curb or something really solid. So I'd say another thing that's probably actually in your toolkit is a spare mech hanger. If you don't have, I would say pack 2, it's very worthwhile. Often they're quite expensive, but they will be unique for your bike. So that's why it's really, really important to make sure that you've got the one that you need before you go to that race expo and try and wander around for several hours, wasting energy, wasting time, and probably annoying quite a lot of mechanics by asking, have you got this really specific mech hanger, which they probably won't have. So buy before you go racing and make sure you've got at least 2. Probably would be useful to also know how to change it. Often there's sort of like different bolts that you need to undo. It's not rocket science, but it'd be good to have a heads up beforehand.
Okay, I'm going to put this on before I take the bike out because I don't want to create chaos. I don't have a new hanger here, so we don't want to break it. I'm also not at a race though, so...
Yeah, exactly.
There you go.
There you go.
All good. Okay. Let's pop this out of here. You'll notice when I was traveling, I put a cover over my chainstay, just because the chain is going to bounce around a little bit. You don't want to scratch that up. You can use various covers. Some bike bags have specific covers that go over that to protect it. This one doesn't, or if it did, I've long since lost it. But just a cloth over there keeps it protected so that you don't ruin that chainstay. Oh yeah, nice, shiny, as you can see, my bike with its glittery paint job. Okay, rear wheel on, because that is the support. As we've said, you don't want to be putting your bike down. This is another big problem that we see quite a lot. So I do have, if you can get, you see here, I've got a spacer in my disc brake. That is to stop my disc brake clamping shut. We'll get to that in a minute if that has happened to you. Easy fix, but prevention is better than cure.
Wheel,
thank you. Okay, wheel is on. As you can see, this is unplugged. That was done on purpose so that the rear derailleur wasn't hanging on that while I was traveling. You're gonna plug that in, and this is also important. Make sure it clicks when you push it in, because if that's not plugged in properly, that'll be the thing that pops out halfway through your race and you'll be like, what is going on? Why are my gears not working? Make sure it's plugged in properly. Okay, front wheel, brake spacer in there too.
So just to reiterate, the reason why you've got a brake spacer in there with modern hydraulic brakes, they've got a pad advance system, so whereby as the pad wears and you pull the lever, the pads kind of move in, so it means that the lever feel should be really consistent all the way through. Unfortunately, what that same system means is if there's no disc in there and you pull the brake lever, it advances the pistons and the pads further and further out. And I've seen it in quite a few cases where the pads are touching each other, which obviously means it's very difficult to slide a disc in there. Now, don't be tempted to use the disc to kind of wedge it open. The discs, as we've already mentioned, are really quite fragile. They're really strong for braking, but in certain side loads, it's quite easy to bend them. So just be really mindful. If the pads have come together, don't use the disc to unstick them.
There is a specific tool for that. So while we're on it, let's talk about it. It is also in my tool bag. This is a disc brake spreader. I mean, it's a pretty cheap tool. This is an expensive version of a very cheap tool, but you do get very cheap versions of this. This is the Park Tool PP 1.2, but there are very many versions of this, and they are very cheap. You can get them on Amazon or Wiggle or wherever. Carry this with you too. You might never use it, but the day that your discs clamp together and you can't get that disc in is the day it's going to save your race, save your bike, and save your trip to the bike shop. Another very useful tool to have in your tool bag. Okay, we're pretty much done now, except for putting the saddle on, and my bike is done. Then we're going to run through some of the issues you might find. All right, putting my saddle in, obviously, you want to get the saddle height spot on. This took some forethought. You do have numbers on most of the saddles that will tell you what your setting is, and you can take a photo of that before you take your bike apart. But so often what people do is they pull the bike saddle out and then afterwards go, ooh, I forgot to measure that or mark that. So before you do, put a piece of tape around is generally the easiest thing. If you put the tape exactly where you at the lowest point, then you know exactly that it's right. It can't go any further in than that, and you can have your saddle height exactly right for race day. You want your saddle height exactly right for race day. I know you think a millimeter or two won't make a difference, but if you've been training on one particular saddle height and then you travel to your race and change about 2 or 3 millimeters, you just sacrifice a whole lot of power for nothing. Okay.
And you'll feel awful, like
and
having a saddle,
feel
even subtly,
less.
like even. Okay, for me, I'm not quite as
You're
precise.
a millimeter man.
I'm not. I'll say I'm like a 5 mil man, and I'll notice about 5 mil. But it does make a big difference, and you'll have really tired legs, and you'll wonder, why am I having an awful day? Why are my legs rubbish? It's the flight. It's the jet lag. No, it's just your saddle's at the wrong height. And the tape's great. I mean, a little tip that I do on mountain bikes, because I do this similar thing, is you can get the quick chain links. So if you use your tape around your seat post, you can also wrap a second section of tape just on the back edge to secure some of the quick chain links. So hopefully it would never happen and you don't break a chain in a race, but with the quick links, it means you're not just stranded.
Okay, let's pause there, Owen, and let's talk through some of the issues you might have. Okay, the sharp-eyed viewers may have noticed that we've swapped bikes. Obviously, I didn't have both of those bikes inside the bike bag, but not everyone has a Canyon Speedmax CFR to pull out of their bike bag and a specific bike bag that goes with it. A lot of people are going to have a road bike when they travel to their race, and that has some additional complications, especially how you travel to it. Now, often with a road bike, in order to fit in a bag, you can take the handlebars off, you're going to undo the headset, which means you're going to put it on the side, and then you've got to put it back together. So there's a couple of things you need to be aware of if you have had to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I would say if you get it vaguely bike-shaped, as we've done with a triathlon bike, well, it's a similar process, but it's not a case of just kind of going, cool, wheels in, stem vaguely in place, I'll just go ride. So doing a basic M check, so starting from kind of the rear derailleur and working up to seat clamp, then dropping down and checking, and literally do check the tightness of this. So front mech, and make sure that you've got a chain watch as well, and make sure that's lined up in case it's slipped. Check that sort of the chain rings aren't bent. I have seen that, unfortunately, where, yeah, chain rings have got bent, but we'll skip on that. Move back up, then we've got the headset, which is the bit we were kind of like where we started. So there's lots of different iterations of headsets out there, and some of the more sort of like aerodynamic or futuristic aero road bikes have slightly different configurations. So it's probably worth getting an idea of how that works before you take it apart, which I know sounds kind of like, very optimistic and useful after the case. Essentially, the system works by having a preload cap on top, the stem, which is sort of effectively a large spacer, and that all pulls the system together, but you need to have enough space at the top of the system that allows the preload cap to, or the top of the headset cap, to pull the fork into place and load the bearings correctly. So make sure if you've got lots of spacers that A, you've got them in the same order that you had before, because obviously that will impact your bike fit and that will change dramatically. So I would say if you've got a grouping here of 1 or 2, actually a bit of tape can help just stick them together. The classic taking a picture is also really helpful because you know which order they go in. Just be really mindful that sometimes inside there may be a wedge or other features inside underneath this lower bearing. So what I've seen fairly successfully is when you take the top cap off, an upper spacer, and then the stem, is then wrapping some tape around your steer tube, and that just holds everything together. So yeah, make sure you've taped it up so the important bits in here aren't missing. I guess if we've got our spread and you had to remove a fork, which sometimes you do with certain bags, yeah, I know, it's scary.
Get a different bag.
Yeah, I mean, that is actually the best advice, is just get a different bag. But if you haven't and you're trapped, there shouldn't be any play with this assembly. So get all the parts together, get them in the right order. Don't do up the stem.
Yeah, this is a common problem. So people put the stem on and then they tighten these 2 bolts. and then they put the preload cap on and tighten it down, and they made it really tight, and they made those really tight. And then when you move your bike, you will feel like there's a whole bunch of play in that. And that's because you haven't actually preloaded before you tighten those stem bolts. So make sure you do it in the right order. This is the most important thing when you're putting your road bike back together. Okay, so once you've done that, put some air in the tires, put the pedals on. Anything else that we need to be aware of? We've traveled with a carbon bike.
I mean, yeah, I would just take a good look all the way over the bike. I mean, it's not probably that great for you in terms of like finding a crack before you race.
Terrifying prospect, actually.
It is, but the other option of it breaking and failing in the race, obviously it's much better to find the crack beforehand.
More terrifying, for sure, yeah.
Exactly,
so, give your bike, your carbon frame, a good once-over. What are we looking for?
We're looking for really small hairline cracks and fractures, basically. Carbon doesn't dent, so if you've got an alloy frame or even a steel frame, I guess technically an alloy, but a steel frame, which you might not have because they are on the sort of like the more dense side of things, they do dent, which is great. So if it's had an impact while it's been in the bike bag or it's been in the bike box, you'll see that physical impact and it will stay there. And depending on the dent, it might be okay. Carbon fibre is amazingly strong and it is super light, but it doesn't dent. So sometimes you might see a sort of like a small sort of like circular crack and then some kind of very hairline cracks around it. That would be a dent on another bike. And depending on where that is, that could be, game over, unfortunately, for your race weekend.
So any kind of hairline crack, any kind of damage to the frame whatsoever, a nick, a chip, are we riding it or are we binning it? Or something in between?
Okay, depending on where they are. I mean, if you've got like two parts for frame when it was one piece, unfortunately it's all over Red Rover. But depending on where the cracks are, okay, if it's on a fork or it's around the head tube, I wouldn't ride it because they're under lots of impact. And okay, you might be a super smooth rider, but sometimes you take a bad line choice, you hit kind of like, not necessarily a curb, but you hit a pothole and the impact can like spike up.
All right, that's obviously worst case scenario, catastrophic. But what about just the simple things? Your brakes are making a rubbing noise or a ticking noise. Your gears are just not quite changing right. Does that mean trip to the bike shop?
Potentially, which sounds bad, but I guess there's some stuff that you can do straight away. So with a disc brake, that tool that you've bought for resetting pads is actually really good. Yeah, just to reset your pads. Sometimes even with the pad spacer in, they might have shifted. And effectively you want those pads to come in really evenly. And sometimes even with a pad spacer, they can just drift a little bit.
So it's a good idea to get them as wide as possible, then put the bike in and let them equally clamp down on that disc.
And sometimes you might have to pump the lever a couple of times, so don't panic and think, oh God, I'll have to have a brake bleed if it's a hydraulic system. Don't hit panic stations, just keep pumping that lever. The pads will work in and the pistons will cycle closer and that will reset. Obviously, if you've got rim brakes, which are still really popular, still very light, those can easily, you can knock a caliper out of alignment. So you might have enough clearance to spin the wheel and it look okay, but do check, look from above, pull the brake lever and check that both pads are hitting equally. With gears, I mean, do run through all the gears. So, yeah.
If they are not changing smoothly, something's happened in travel, what are we looking for? So
look at the rear mech, look at it from kind of the end of the bike, and check that it's all in alignment. Check that the wheel, especially if you've got a QR, check that undo it, push the bike down on the back of the saddle and make sure that the wheel is actually straight before you do the quick release up. So check for those relatively simple things that can cause havoc with oh my God, my gears are out. Make sure that, okay, we've tightened the rear mech on. Make sure actually the mech hanger is also tight because those can loosen. Yeah, check that. If you see that the mech is not sitting sort of parallel and where the chain is sitting isn't all in alignment, then it's time to go and have a chat with your friendly bike mechanic.
So we shouldn't be trying to index our gears or anything after travel. That shouldn't have gone out. If your gears are not changing, something's gone wrong, not the indexing.
Exactly. So I guess we're looking at Di2. You might be traveling with cables. Often the cable routing is not one continuous section. So make sure that if you've taken the bar out, for example, that when you're clamping it back in, you haven't kind of panicked and gone, I've got to rush because I've got to catch up with those people to do another run. You probably don't need to do another run. You've done lots of training. You're fine. You're going to dominate.
Another video entirely.
Exactly. But make sure you don't pinch your bar and sort of like it. Well, even with Di2 cables, don't pinch the bar stem combo with cables, be it Di2 or brake cables or hydraulic cables. So yeah, check the line of the cable and check that that's all okay.
Yep. All right. I think we've covered everything there. I think the key takeaway here is take your time. Make sure when you get to your hotel, your destination, you sit down for a while, have something to eat and drink, make sure your area is nice and clear, and then tackle putting your bike together. It is not something you do the moment you get in the door when you're absolutely knackered from a long flight and you're really tired. It is something that requires a little bit of concentration and a little bit of forethought, and then it'll all go nice and smoothly and you'll have a safe, happy bike to ride. You can also ruin your race if you do it not very well and very rushed in a bad environment to do it. I hope this video has helped you. Thank you so much, Owen,
You're welcome.
for all your advice.
Thanks for having me.
I think we only just scratched the surface of all the advice Owen could give us here today. We'll have him back on for another video where we go a little bit more in depth, potentially on our bike maintenance. But for now, thanks for watching, happy traveling and happy racing.